Hey, welcome everybody to today's discussion about partisanship and intergovernmental relations. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Anna Esselment, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. She earned her PhD at the University of Western Ontario, and her dissertation there focused on partisanship and intergovernmental relations. Dr. Esselment currently researches and writes in the fields of Canadian politics, campaigns and elections, political marketing, and of course intergovernmental relations. We're very happy to have you here today, Anna, and I'll turn the floor over to you, and we look forward to a stimulating discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Jared. I appreciate it, and thank you everybody for coming out this lunchtime. So yes, I'm going to be talking to you about work that I did do for my dissertation. So I've kind of gone off this a little bit in the last few years, but I still think it's a very important area of research, and I kind of just scratched the surface here, and I think a lot more needs to be done. And the reason I was interested in this, well, I was mostly motivated by two things. One, I was always very keenly interested in party politics. And I think it started, I think it was the end of my first year university, and I came home and I had no job, and I think it was the 1997 federal election. And I thought to myself, well, if I have nothing else to do, I might as well just go out and see what politics is actually like. And I spent a lot of that spring dropping literature and knocking on doors and going to rallies and then accompanying the candidate. And it was so much fun, and there were so many people that I met, and we really felt like there was this common cause together to triumph against the evil of the other parties. And it kind of spurred me to get involved more in party politics. So I had this interest in parties generally. And then particularly as I worked my way through university and when I went to graduate school, I also then developed an interest in sort of the question of why and how governments got along. Right? So why is it that they cooperate, or why is there conflict between federal and provincial governments? And so when I started my dissertation, I decided that what I would do is examine some of the connections between those two things. So essentially the argument that I was trying to make once I examined some government transitions and intergovernmental agreements and some discretionary spending, that partisanship can actually be a variable that explains why governments get along or not. And to be clear here, because I know many of you work as public servants in Alberta, the focus that I was taking was really at the political level. So I was really examining politicians and their political staff and their political advisors and the roles that they were playing in intergovernmental relations. And what I realized is that it actually demanded a re-examination of the links between parties, and the fact that party cousins actually are interested in getting each other elected to power. And there was a movement away from this in the literature, and I had to sort of bring that back. So the first part of the project was kind of examining how parties cooperate and how they fight elections. And then the second part to kind of bring it together was also this, new research in the literature at the time on the centralization of power. The fact that, there was growing influence of the central agencies, particularly the Prime Minister's office, and the staff within them. So that kind of was what, my focus was here. So I'll kind of take you through some of this. So first of all, and this is the first time, I'll be honest, this is the first time I'm using Prezi, and sometimes it makes me nauseous, and if it makes you nauseous, I apologize, but hopefully it's a different thing of doing from PowerPoint for me, so I thought I would try it. So anyway, my question then was whether or not partisanship played a role in federal-provincial relations in Canada. And the way I was conceiving partisanship was to actually denote what I had felt when I was in the party. So this notion of a sense of loyalty to a party, teamwork, unity in the behavior of party members and activists, and that you felt that whether you were, a provincial conservative or a federal conservative, you were united in your partisanship. And the Oxford English Dictionary talks about an adherent or a proponent of a party, particularly a devoted supporter. So that was the concept that I started with. Now, I was also having always sort of also reminding my students when I was a TA and when I was doing the research that partisanship matters in a sense because we have party government in Canada, right? Premiers and prime ministers are not just disembodied actors. You know, they have to actually galvanize their parties and their supporters, and they have to keep people united. So party government would suggest that partisanship should play a role in politics generally, even if it's between governments. The theoretical basis for this was work that I had read by William Riker on federalism, and in particular I found intriguing this article that he wrote with a co-author, Ronald Shapps, in 1957 about harmony and disharmony in government. And he developed an index of harmony and disharmony, and he was examining the United States. But in a nutshell, what they found was that intergovernmental relations was better, or governments got along better between the states and the central government when their partisan complexions were the same. And there was more conflict when their partisan complexions differed. And I thought, okay, well, this is really neat. And there had been some replications of this work in areas like, you know, in Australia, but not a lot had been done in Canada. And I wondered why. Why was there not very much done on partisanship in the Canadian context? And so when I looked into this, what I found was that many of our federalism scholars in Canada were actually quite dismissive of the partisan dimension. And conflict or cooperation really had nothing to do with the stripe of government. And this, I think, came out of a period of, you know, province building in Canada and a real sense that, you know, provincial interests were the foremost consideration of premiers, you know, in addition to the fact that intrastate federalism, like our Senate, was not doing a great job of representing the provinces. And so that became the job of provincial governments. So you had really great federalism scholars like Richard Simeon and Donald Smiley who really didn't think that the partisan stripe of government had much to do with intergovernmental relations at all. And in many ways they were right. They came up with what, you know, I call the traditional variables to explain cooperation or conflict. And in most cases, these variables do explain a lot. They are quite powerful in their ability to say this is why one government has done one thing and another government has done another thing. So these four variables that are probably quite familiar to you are, you know, provincial interests. So provincial interests are usually primarily economic, but they also involve the province's character, its population, its size, its wealth. Those are all things that will determine what it is a provincial government will stand up for or press for from the federal government. Another traditional variable that explains conflict or cooperation is the ideological position of the government. So its view of the political system and the role and the balance of governments within it. You also have status goals of governments that matter. So partisan stripe doesn't matter if what it is that a premier wants is prestige, right, or credit for something, for an agreement that's been negotiated or some kind of policy win, or likewise if they actually want to avoid blame. So those kinds of status goals can also explain behaviors of government. And the final traditional variable is the different perspectives of government. So if you have a majority government, that can affect how you react to subnational governments and their demands. Or if you have a minority government, or how close you are to an election. So those different perspectives can have an impact. And I think a lot of the behavior of governments can be slotted into one or more of those categories. And of course, not all scholars believe that only variables other than partisanship have explanatory power. So you have people like Michael Stein and even R. McGregor Dawson who all noted the politics in politics, that partisanship would matter and we did need to think about the stripes of government, but nothing really went very far to examine that more thoroughly. So part of the reason for why federalism scholars, in my mind, part of the reason why they weren't digging as deeply into partisanship had a lot to do with what party scholars were looking at also. So if you were interested in political parties, what you were finding throughout sort of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond were that parties were actually becoming formally disentangled, right? So in the beginning, parties tended to be pretty tight. They were all integrated organizations. So an example today would be the NDP. If you join the provincial NDP, you automatically become a member of the federal NDP because they are a tight-knit organization. But certainly for the Liberals and the Conservatives, the trend was for them to become uncoupled. So they became separate and distinct organizations. They had their own constitutions. They had their own memberships. When you fundraise, you're fundraising for either a federal party or a provincial party. So formally, they were becoming really distinct. So partisanship really shouldn't matter that much because political parties had few connections between them. And that was sort of the thinking of scholars at the time. So it turns out, though, if you do a little bit of digging, what you will find that parties across the federal-provincial divide can actually be quite close and cooperative, and there are a few of us who've been looking into this integrated or trying to challenge this, the assumption that parties are formally distinct and thus have very few connections between them. And formally that may be true. Informally, there are a lot of connections across the levels. So for the most part, parties of the same stripe share voters. There are a number of consistent voters out there. You may vote, you know, provincially Liberal. You may also then likely vote federally Liberal. They share members, so there's a lot of overlap in the membership. They share activists, whether it's grassroots members, party staffers, party professionals during campaigns. Elected officials will move across the levels. Even party leaders will do that. Parties, turns out, they share technology. So you think about like the Liberal list for identifying voters, that's shared between the federal party and provincial parties. They use the same voter contact companies in an election. They'll have campaign universities geared to all of their partisans. It doesn't matter what level they're at. Parties in Atlantic provinces do platforming together, messaging, there's candidate recruitment, so there are a number of ways that parties are actually quite close. And I examined this when I was looking at how parties fight elections, and I'll just give you a little bit of a flavor. When I was looking at elections from 2004 and 2006, you'll see just some of these quotes, like Bernard Lord campaigned very hard for the CPC in 2004, and he even said, I'm campaigning as hard as I campaigned for myself, right? Lord was interested in his party, and he encouraged everyone in his party to get out and campaign for the federal Conservatives. The Liberals in Ontario are also very close. So in 2004 and in 2006, the Liberal organization in Ontario had, you know, they cleared out their offices on election day, and there were at least 100 people working on full-time on the federal campaign. So staffers would leave Queen's Park and take jobs as campaign managers for their federal counterparts. And on election day, there's, you know, tumbleweeds going through Queen's Park because both the Conservatives and the Liberals just clear out so that they all can campaign for their party cousins. And we even see this in a province like British Columbia. So British Columbia has interesting party politics, as many of you are familiar with, and the Provincial Liberal Party is actually home to both federal Liberals and federal Conservatives. So there's no overt cooperation during an election the way you would see, for example, in Ontario, or where you would see that in the Atlantic provinces, but there certainly is cooperation kind of under the table. So if you are a provincial Liberal MLA and you are interested in helping a federal Liberal candidate, you would do things like call that candidate and say, I'm going to send you people, and they're going to campaign for you all weekend, or they will campaign for you for the next 2 weeks, and that federal candidate will say, great, and I will make sure that when it's your turn, I'll do the same thing. So the point of all this is that, you know, parties are connected, and that contributes to partisanship possibly having an effect. right? So how might we see this? So the reason why fighting elections and campaign cooperation matters is because of what Sid Noel talks about in terms of a modern use of patronage. So what we see is that there are top campaign workers, right, political professionals, who then move into powerful positions in the PMO, right? You might be the federal leader's press secretary in an election, and the next thing you know, you're the director of communications for the prime minister, right? So you have these political professionals that run these campaigns and who together organize and coordinate cooperation during a campaign with their counterparts. And if they're successful, they move into these powerful positions. So combine this with what we know about the center of government, right? And this is true certainly with the Prime Minister's office. It's certainly true also for Premier's offices in a number of provinces, particularly the larger ones. They become the epicenter of power. So we have campaign workers who have moved into these centers. The center is where a lot of decisions come from. And then if we take this with the fact that there is a growing influence, or you could call it celebrity or power, of partisan political staffers in the Canadian government. And so here's a sampling of a few that you would probably be familiar with. And to be perfectly honest, sometimes it's hard to find pictures of these people when they're not testifying at some committee. So I managed to do that, but in many cases when you're looking for powerful political staffers, they're usually testifying in front of some parliamentary committee. But there you go. So you can combine all of that, and this can lead to partisanship having an effect on intergovernmental relations. But how does this happen exactly? And I do want to be clear that this certainly, again, this was looking at it at a political level, so it's not to at all diminish work done by public servants, because there's lots that goes on at the bureaucratic levels. And I'm also not suggesting that the partisan factor outweighs or outmaneuvers the traditional variables, but I've come up with this in the work that I did, this partisan factor, because you will run across, you will come across instances where the traditional variables just don't explain why a government has behaved one way or another, and so there has to be some other additional variable that can help provide an answer for behavior. So the partisan factor is what I came up with in order to help do that extra explaining. So this is when politicians and political staff do some of the following things, right? So they'll use political channels to help negotiations, or they will use partisan, threats, or they'll call in debts with their cousin at the other level. They may make appeals to cousins caucus or rank and file members. They may want to help or hinder the success of leaders at the other level, or they're simply making decisions because it's good for party unity, right? So these are the kinds of things that the partisan factor tries to capture. Again, I'll give you a flavor of what I'm talking about. So in my work, in my dissertation, I examined government transitions, intergovernmental agreements, and some discretionary spending. So one of the agreements I looked at was the Meech Lake Accord, right? And Meech Lake Accord started off in a very nonpartisan way for the most part, and then became quite partisan at the end, as certainly the federal government, but also certain provincial governments started to get very panicked that it wasn't going to pass, and they started pulling all kinds of partisan levers in order to try to get the accord passed through all the provincial legislatures. But this was an example at the very outset of the accord, as Mulrooney was kind of feeling out the premiers before he called them to Wilson House, and he found that Bill Vander Zalm out in British Columbia was sort of very nonchalant about the whole idea. And when I looked at some of those traditional variables, it didn't explain why Vander Zalm would be that way. And I think for Mulrooney, it was the same thing. Vander Zalm had no real ideological position on the place of Quebec in Canada. There was no real political award or punishment for accommodating Quebec in this way. very little prestige, kind of neutral on provincial interests, but he really just did not give any signal that he was going to come on board. And this is what Newman recounts in his book about Brian Mulroney in the Secret Tapes book, and this is what Mulroney essentially said to Van der Zalm, right? I haven't told my people to vote for the Liberals, but if I do, you're a dead man. That doesn't mean I could elect Tories provincially, but if I were to pull my supporters away from you, you'd be finished, and the NDP would win the next election by default, and you should know I'm prepared to do this, right? And as Newman recounts, when it came time at Wilson House to say whether you were on board with Meech Lake, Van der Zalm was on board, right? So Mulroney essentially uses a partisan threat of sort in order to bring Van der Zalm on board for Meech Lake. We also see shades of this too when I was talking to some of the Liberals who were in power with Paul Martin at the time, noting that when it came time for government transitions, or when it came time with dealing with Ontario in particular, but also other Liberal governments, that they would just say, Liberal governments, provincially, they're safe harbors for us, right? It's great when you can talk to a government and you're pretty sure that they're not trying to screw you, right? Or that you can start with at least the possibility that the other person will come to an agreement, that they're willing to talk to you. Right, and that is all kind of, that's all sort of ensconced in partisanship, in shared partisanship. This was also the case with some of the childcare agreements. They became bilateral agreements, but we see sort of the partisan factor coming out in this. Certainly in Ontario's case, it was a provincial Liberal staffer in Ontario for that first quote. But there were all kinds of reasons why Ontario wanted to get on board with the childcare agreements, and a lot of those traditional factors explain why. It was in their interest. Ideologically, it made sense to the Ontario Liberals. They'd made a similar promise in their own platform in 2003. But the one thing that came out too was that the provincial Liberals wanted to do it for the federal Liberals, that it was critically important for this agreement to pass so that it was part of the federal Liberal re-election plank. Right, so they signed on as quickly as they could. They tried to get a good deal, but they were interested in giving this to Paul Martin because they weren't sure when the next election was, and they definitely wanted the federal Liberals to win. Another Liberal staffer who worked in the federal minister's office was talking, when he was dealing with provincial governments about the childcare agreements, he just said, I never had a frank conversation with any of the Conservative governments provincially. So there just wasn't that sense of trust. Or, if they weren't getting agreements, how you can kind of get is there a political win in there, even if you can't get an agreement? And the federal staffer was saying, you can kind of do that when the provincial government is run by a party of the opposite stripe, right? If you're federal Liberal, Ralph Klein's a great foil, Mike Harris is a great foil, Dalton McGuinty isn't, because it's not in your interest, it's not in their interest, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work to have a political fight like that, when really what's going to happen is that we're going to rely on each other. We can't have bad relations because we will rely on each other come the next election. And just for a second then, I'll talk about this notion of a policy win versus a political win, because I think it's worth repeating that what we do find, or where the partisanship does come up too, that I had in my conversations with people, is that all governments would like a policy win, right? For traditional reasons. It's in your interest to do it. Right? It's great if you can come to an agreement and bring home something tangible to the people of your province, or to say, Canadians, I've done this on behalf of everyone. But where policy wins are elusive, you can actually, if the government is of the opposite stripe at the other level, go for the political win if you need to. Right? So it's really facilitated when governments are of the opposite stripe, and you can get a lot of bashing, and I think we're seeing this in Ontario in particular a lot these days, where the provincial government will try to bash the federal government, and that's something that's occurred since, I think, probably the Federation began. But it is much harder to do that. The political win is far more elusive when you're of the same partisan stripe. So there's much more motivation to get the policy win because you can't actually score political points when it's against your cousin, and particularly when it's in a province where you have close electoral collaboration. So what are the effects then that I saw that came out of the work that I did of the partisan variable? And there are a few that are important, I think. One is that common partisanship provides a natural channel of communication. So this is true between leaders, caucuses, parties, political aides, advisors. You can make calls to one another. You can take calls from one another. When Meech Lake had started to unravel, Brian Mulroney would send liberals to talk to liberals, right? Or liberals would volunteer. People like David Peterson will say, I am going to go and talk to Frank McKenna because we're friends and we're liberals and we actually help each other horizontally when it comes to elections. And I'll take Joe Giz with me, and the three of us as liberals can talk to each other. And on the conservative side, Brian Mulroney would send conservatives to talk to conservatives, right? Because it's a natural channel of communication, which of course then leads to the second part, in that partisanship enhances trust. So it affects the context in which the political process takes place. You can have discussions because you know each other, you assume you're not out to get each other, and you can have kind of free discussions because you just have trust among or between the two. Thirdly, it unites interests regarding political calculations. So in one sense, you can have very frank discussions about difficulties or barriers. And David Peterson would tell me on Meech Lake, they had some very frank conversations with Frank McKenna that his position on Meech Lake was wrong, and this is why it was wrong, and you need to turn yourself around and get on board here. But it's also unites interests when it does come to making political calculations, even if it's about even policy issues. And I think, again, and I know Albertans probably can't stand this, but I'll go back to Ontario. When the Liberals, the provincial Liberals, came to power in 2003, there were a number of outstanding policy issues that had been left over with the Harris-Eves government. And there was a certain political calculation that the federal Liberals made not to resolve those policy issues because they greatly disliked the Harris-Eve regime, particularly the Ontario Liberal MPs. They did not want to hand over any kind of good news to the Ontario government in advance of the provincial election, and they kind of held back on a few things. So one great example is SARS compensation. The provincial Tories had tried really hard to get the federal government to agree to SARS compensation. And the federal Liberals held back on actually making a deal until after the provincial election. And within a month or two, they had a big policy splashy announcement with the Ontario Liberals announcing their SARS compensation, which was actually enhanced from what they had originally agreed or had talked about with the provincial Conservative government. And then there were a number of other very quick policy resolutions between the Liberals in Ontario: affordable housing, national farm income stabilization, highway improvement projects. So you see where those political calculations come in. Finally, it's a political resource. So where traditional factors fail, where you can't move somebody based on the provincial interests, or where you can't move somebody because they don't really care about prestige or gaining credit, you can bring it in order to make someone move. And we see that with Mulroney and Van der Zalm, and there were sort of other examples of that when I did my work. But of course, partisan factor is not unfailing. Right? So political interests are huge when it comes to things like if you're in a minority government position, it's hard to make, you might actually be boxed in on what you can do in terms of maneuvering. It can certainly be overwhelmed by provincial interests. Ego, extreme personality, those things can also trump partisanship. But the fact is, it's still there. You just have to search for it, and there's lots of work that needs to be done on that in particular. And I think moving forward, will be ripe for some better examples too. So what does this mean? What's the implications of partisanship in this election? And there's this great quote from Roger Gibbons who talks about the fact that particularly in Ontario, there is always often between the federal government and the provincial government, intense partisan conflict because the election spoils are huge, right? So you have these partisan conflated conflicts because it is where a lot of seats are. And he was talking at the time about the Ontario Conservatives and the federal Liberals, but we can easily flip that today to see that the same partisan conflation of conflict occurs between Stephen Harper and Kathleen Wynne. So, or even you think like Dalton McGuinty was called the small man of Confederation early on when he became premier, and in 2007 Harper was in town and he went to a rally of Conservatives and he called John Tory the next premier of Ontario. Recently, Joe Oliver and I think Stephen Harper talked about the Ontario pension plan idea as a tax hike. So there's lots of animosity between the parties, and it plays out when it comes to government. And once we actually add in the 15 new seats that we have here in Ontario, I think Gibbons' quote probably means more even now because it is such a battleground. So partisanship will definitely affect this election, and it'll be the case across Canada. So in some cases we will see obviously provincial parties that want to help out their respective federal cousins win the election, and there have been sort of at least 5 relatively recent provincial elections, which means that their provincial machines are ready to go. Right, so there's something that the federal government can help in the provinces rely on. I also think partisanship will be a factor because I think we're going to see a pretty nasty fight in Ontario. There will definitely be some fights in BC too. But right now the relationship between Harper and Wynne is pretty frosty. Wynne talked about in May, now this is before the election, but she's still a premier, about how Harper smirked at the idea of an Ontario pension plan. And she released her letters written to Harper about, we haven't met for a year, can you please meet with me? And his response often being, Ontario needs to actually focus on getting their fiscal house in order and not on being confrontational. So we see that there is definitely partisan rancor between the Ontario government and the federal government, and this will play out in their, in the election in, let's assume, October. The other dimension, and I think this will be the case for a lot of Liberal parties across Ontario or across Canada, but I again am going to highlight Ontario, and I apologize for doing that. But what we do see partisanship here now too is that Kathleen Wynne and Justin Trudeau are very, very close, right? There's kind of little light between them at the moment, and Kathleen Wynne is not at all afraid of being seen in public with Justin Trudeau, with doing lots of, when she was asking Harper to show up to the Council of Federation in Ottawa, Justin Trudeau's right beside her, agreeing that, Harper should be there. The Liberals caucused in London in the beginning of January, and certainly southwestern Ontario is a place where I think the Liberals hope to pick up a couple of seats, certainly at least one in London. And at that caucus, Deb Matthews was there, and she's one of a very powerful provincial minister and a close confidant of Kathleen Wynne, and she was there. She's from London, but essentially the signal was that the Ontario Liberal government would very much like to see Justin Trudeau and the federal Liberals back in power. And Trudeau makes a fairly big deal of talking about cooperation and what could be done for Ontario when governments get along. And he really is playing the partisan card. And to wrap up, because I think I've probably gone over my time here, my sense is that the partisan factor and partisanship will actually matter more in the future. And I say this because I'm starting to do new work on this concept of the permanent campaign, and doing more work on the role of political staff and political advisors. But I don't know what your sense is in Alberta, but certainly maybe because we feel it so strongly here in Ontario, but parties are becoming a little more partisan generally. Like ideologically, they're moving a little bit further. Certainly parties, I mean, I think we could argue that the Conservative Party has become much more partisan. Arguments have been made that Canadian parties are no longer brokerage parties, that they're not as, central as they used to be, and there's far more use of wedge politics, and with the ability to mine data and segment voters, and with a decline in the number of us who are actually going out to vote, that parties can use wedge politics and little issues that can divide Canadians because they only need to gather up certain segments of voters in order to win seats and to win government. So we may find that there's far more sort of hyper-partisanship both in Parliament and between governments, and that this particular partisan factor in intergovernmental relations may actually become more prominent. So I think I'll leave it at that, and it's just something for you to think about. And again, sort of scratched the surface here on work that could be done on this. And I'd be very interested to find out your thoughts, particularly as public servants, on what you see in terms of the role of your premier's offices and political staff, and what your sense is of all of this. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Jared.
Perfect, thanks, Anna. And we'll continue our conversation here live after we close the live YouTube broadcast. Just encourage folks that are tuning in online, if you have any questions or comments about this, please feel free to use the comment box below the YouTube video, or you can tweet using the hashtag #PartyIGR, or you can send Anna or I an email, and I'm sure we'd both be happy to discuss it further with you. But for now, thank you very much, Anna, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great.